All right, good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining this event presented in the American Inspiration Author Series in partnership with the Boston Public Library, who is hosting us tonight. It's great to have you with us tonight in the land of history, exploring narratives of the Old South, Black history, and the long road to emancipation. I'm Margaret Talcott, Director of Literary Programs at American Ancestors New England Historic Genealogical Society. On your screen is the schedule for our hour-long event featuring author Carole Emberton and her remarkable new work, To Walk About in Freedom. We're fortunate tonight that Dr. Emberton will present to us in full and with illustrations. It's going to be a remarkable presentation. Before we hear more about her and get started, some quick reminders though. We are in a Zoom webinar format, which means that your microphone is muted and your video is off. We can't take your comments in the chat box, but do look there for relevant information and helpful links. We asked for your questions as you registered. Thank you for those. If you have additional queries, enter them into the Q&A box, which is launched from the bottom of your screen. We'll get to as many of those questions as we can. A video of tonight's program will be shared on our websites in the weeks ahead. You'll see those specific links in the chat. Of course, the real education and enlightenment comes from reading the book, To Walk About in Freedom. I could not put it down this past week. It is really brilliantly woven together. Copies can be purchased through our partners at Porter Square Books in Cambridge, Mass. Use the code AMINSP22 as you order, and the book you'll receive will be signed by the author on a book plate. As I said to my colleagues this morning, her work breaks new ground because it's based on rarely referenced archives. It helps us truly to create a full picture of the American South through several eras and the Black experience in the South. And to introduce Dr. Emberton and to start us off, I welcome our host tonight from the Boston Public Library. I'll see you after the presentation, but Kristen, welcome and over to you.
Thank you, Margaret, and to the New England Historic Genealogical Society. And thank you, Dr. Emberton, for being here with us this evening. On behalf of the Boston Public Library, welcome. I'm Kristen Motti, a programs librarian here at the Central Library. This evening, I have the pleasure of telling you a little bit, just a little bit, about tonight's featured author. Dr. Carole Emberton is Associate Professor of History at the University of Buffalo, a National Endowment for the Humanities public scholar. She is the author of the prize-winning Beyond Redemption. She has written for both the New York Times and the Washington Post, and she lives in Buffalo, New York. Dr. Carole Emberton, welcome, and thank you for being here with us this evening.
Thank you so much for having me. Thanks to Margaret and to Kristen, and thanks to all of you as well out there in audience land. I can't see you, but I really appreciate you sharing your evening with me and coming here to hear more about Priscilla Joyner's long emancipation. As Margaret mentioned, we're going to be taking questions at the end. If you haven't submitted a question already, please, put one in the Q&A box down at the bottom of your screen. And if we don't get to your questions, please contact me via my website. That information has been put up in the chat, and I'll be glad to answer any questions via email that we don't get to tonight. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen with you. Here we go. Play the slideshow. And here we are. All right, so I'm talking about my new book, and I hope to persuade you that you should ban it, right? There's a lot of talk these days about banning books and banning particular kinds of topics in our school classrooms, particularly topics related to questions of race and slavery. And that's exactly what this book is about. And of course, every author, if they're honest, would love to have their book banned because that usually means a great increase in sales. For instance, a few weeks ago, when the graphic novel Mouse was banned by a Tennessee school board, the sales increased by 743% in just one. So we'd all love to have our book banned if we're totally honest. But all jokes aside, we are experiencing serious challenges to academic freedom and historical knowledge, challenges that have to do with central questions of American history and how it's taught in our classrooms, our school classrooms and our university classrooms. I'm a university teacher. I teach courses on the Old South, the American Civil War, the Jim Crow era. So, you know, this is my bread and butter. This is how I make my living by teaching these topics. And I will say that the resistance to acknowledging what I refer to as the long emancipation, right? The sense that emancipation was an extended process. It wasn't a momentary event or a singular event. It was something that unfolded over decades. Some might even argue over centuries, that we are still, in fact, living through the repercussions of slave emancipation in the United States. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And I'm used to students pushing back and resisting, acknowledging and accepting, you know, the problematic nature of American history when it comes to these issues. So that's really nothing new. But what is new is the, you know, sort of national focus and the efforts of state legislatures in particular to really put legislation in place that would formally prohibit the discussion of some of these topics. Let me talk about that for just a few moments. Okay, so beginning, you know, in the last year or so, last year and a half, many state legislatures and local school boards have put together legislation and various kinds of restrictions on the teaching of various kinds of information, particularly things that have to do with topics related to race, related to the history of slavery, but also gender-related topics. I'm sure most, if not all of you, are familiar with Florida's recent Don't Say Gay bill. So this is really, in the last couple of years, really sort of come to a head in our culture. There have been efforts, and there are efforts to ban particular kinds of history books. A couple that come to mind are Nicole Hannah-Jones' Pulitzer Prize-winning 1619 Project, Ibram Kennedy's How to Be an Anti-Racist, and many, many more. In my own state, the state of New York, there is currently a bill before the Assembly to prohibit the teaching of any of these concepts to do with race or sex that should make any student feel uncomfortable or guilty or feel bad about themselves. And this is really problematic for me as a teacher, because my pedagogical sort of mission is to make students feel uncomfortable about whatever. I believe a central component of education, no matter what you are studying, students should be pushed outside of their comfort zone. They're going to be learning new things that they've never encountered before. They shouldn't be afraid to fail. It's going to be hard, and they might feel uncomfortable, right? And this is true whether you're learning engineering or history, but I think it's particularly important for history, because otherwise you're not really taking a history class, or you're not learning historical information. It's really, if all it does is sort of reinforce the beliefs you held previously, or just makes you feel good or makes you feel proud, that's not history, that's propaganda. Most of what is sort of at the heart of this uproar over history education is something called critical race theory. And I'm sure you've heard that term, but many of you, I'm sure, unless you come from a legal background, you've been to law school, or you're an academic like me, you may not really understand what critical race theory is. And basically, as I said, it's something that really emerged through legal education to talk about the way that legal systems can systems, even though they're supposed to be race neutral or colorblind, still are inscribed with racialized understandings and racialized privileges for white people against people of color. And, you know, just kind of to put it simply, there are kind of three, I think, foundational principles of critical race theory that is shared with many historians, including myself, of American history. And if you read my book, you're going to become much more familiar with these. So one is the system is not broken, whether that's the legal system or the economic system, it's made that way, right? Racism is not a symptom of a broken system. It is in fact the way the system is set up to work. Secondly, even good people can be implicated and are implicated in systems of racial oppression. You don't have to be a monster in order to have racist beliefs or to behave in ways or to reap the benefits and privileges of these systems of racial oppression. And finally, the legacies of slavery are still with us. And sometimes this is the most controversial assertion and one that I find that my students have the most trouble accepting. They think, well, you know, that happened 150, 165 years ago. How could it possibly still be having an effect on the way we live? And this is what I'm talking about when I'm talking about the long emancipation. And historians will argue that rather than see emancipation as a singular event, right? Something that happened on January the 1st, 1863, with Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, right? That's emancipation. But that was just the beginning. Emancipation unfolded, the search African Americans and freed people had to create free lives, to give real meaning to freedom, to establish their political rights, to find some kind of economic security. And as I'm going to be talking about with Priscilla Joyner, to find an inner sense of belonging and a place of security and care and love. Those struggles, that journey took much, much longer. And for the charter generation of freedom, of which Priscilla was a member, and by the charter generation, I mean the men and women who were born into slavery and who came of age during the Civil War and its aftermath, for the charter generation of freedom, it took many of them entire lifetimes to make that journey. And there are historians who will argue that we are still in the midst of the long emancipation, that it did not ever really come to an end because the questions, the big sort of weighty questions that erupted during the Civil War and in the wake of emancipation about citizenship, about rights, about access to education, about economic equality, access to health care, all of these things, these are still issues we are struggling with today. So you can actually draw a line between the 1860s to the 1960s, to the civil rights movement, and then even further to the 21st century and the times that we are living with now and the questions that we are still struggling with, these unresolved issues. So that brings me to Priscilla Joyner, who is the real subject of my new book. What does this all have to do with Priscilla Joyner? And she's a woman you've probably never heard of, unless you've read the book already or heard me talking about her. But Priscilla Joyner's life story, which she dictated to a field worker for the Federal Writers Project in the late 1930s, threatened to upend the narrative of American history that most white people at the time had come to accept as irrefutable fact. A narrative that glorified the Old South and absolve the nation's founders for their role in perpetuating hundreds of years of chattel bondage. A narrative that soothed white suffering from hardships, the Great Depression, a narrative that vindicated America as an exceptional nation devoted to democracy and equality as the world teetered on the edge of war and mass genocide. Her story was so threatening to this narrative, in fact, that those in charge of the Writers' Project in Joyner's state of Virginia, where she lived at the time, censored it heavily and ensured that it would not be read for decades. But before I get to that part of the story, I need to explain how the American government became interested in the stories of former slaves and others like Priscilla Joyner in the first place. And that was because of the Federal Writers' Project. The Federal Writers' Project was part of the New Deal. It was part of the Works Progress Administration. It was one of the first federally funded public history projects in the United States. And one of the things that the Federal Writers' Project was in charge of, and they did lots of different things. They created some of those fantastic state guide series to all the states. They scoured archives and courthouses and people's attics all throughout the United States looking for historical materials and artifacts. But they also collected the life stories of everyday Americans. Thousands and thousands of life stories, of oral histories. And they were particularly interested, according to one historian, in capturing the resourceful, unembittered men and women who were coping with social disaster at the time, the Great Depression. And they wanted the details of survival that these everyday people carried with them throughout their lives, because they hoped that these stories would be a source of inspiration for all Americans who were facing hardships during the Great Depression, but also the country as a whole, who we were also sort of facing and trying to come to terms with the rise of fascism in Europe. And the architects of these projects imagined that Americans had valuable stories of sort of grit and determination and a small d democracy that would inspire people all over the world. But not everyone was initially sure that ex-slaves should be included in this collection of life histories, except for this man, Sterling Brown, who was a poet and a professor at Howard University. Brown fought very, very hard against the notion that ex-slaves, formerly enslaved people, were too mired in the past. And that's what some of the white leaders of the Federal Writers' Project thought. They thought they were too old, they were too mired in the past, they would only want to talk about slavery. No one wanted to hear about slavery, and they all imagined the readers of these oral histories and the books that they wanted to produce from them were going to be white audiences. And like the New York State Assembly, that bill I showed you just a few minutes ago, they didn't want to make anybody feel bad. They wanted people to be uplifted. They wanted people to be inspired. And they were really skeptical that former slaves would have any kind of inspirational message that their audiences, could grasp onto. But Sterling Brown believed that ex-slaves were guardians of Southern folk culture. He had spent many years studying their language, their vernacular expression. He was really in love with the way that rural Black Southerners spoke, the idioms, the phrases that they used. And as he became director of what was known as the Office of Negro Studies, that was the term they used at the time, and he was in charge of reading the transcripts of the interviews with ex-slaves that the field workers, who were mostly white, were sending back to him at his office in Washington. And I've read many, many letters where he's writing to his superiors at the Writers' Project, complaining about how the Old South lingers on, right? That many of these transcripts and essays in the South were really filled with this kind of moonlight and magnolias mythology about how wonderful and happy everything was before the Civil War, and then how the Civil War and particularly Emancipation had ruined what was this idyllic society. Brown hoped that these interviews with people like Priscilla Joyner would help him and other scholars rewrite American history from the Black point of view, to really offer a counter narrative, or rather many counter narratives, to this mythologized, romanticized version of Southern history that was really dominant at the time. But he was up against some formidable opponents. And one of them that I talk about a lot in the book is this woman named Eudora Ramsey Richardson. Eudora Ramsey Richardson was the state director in Virginia of the Virginia Writers Project, which was sort of the state level iteration of the Federal Writers Project. So each state had its own sort of version of the big Federal Writers Project. So she was in charge of the Virginia Writers Project. And she was a writer. She was a biographer. She had written a biography of Confederate Vice President Alexander Hamilton Stevens. She was the one who was the supervisor of the people who were going to interview Priscilla Joyner and the other ex-slaves in Virginia. And now, an interesting thing to note about Virginia: while most of the oral histories throughout the United States were taken by white supervisors and editors, Virginia is one of the few states that had a majority Black crew of field workers who were doing the interviewing. At various times, they had 10 to 12 interviewers, African-American interviewers, who were going out and interviewing people like Priscilla Joyner. And their goal is to produce a written volume, basically a history textbook called The Negro in Virginia. And this is going to sort of tell the history of the state of Virginia, but placing Black people at its center. So it's really a remarkable sort of project for the late 1930s. But Virginia, or Eudora Ramsey Richardson rather, is the supervisor of this entire project. But the field workers, the people who are going to be interviewing Priscilla Joyner and the other ex-slaves, are mostly African-American. Now, Richardson, as I said, she was a published biographer. She also considered herself to be a Southern progressive, which at the time she had been a supporter of women's suffrage in Virginia. And she considered herself to be a racial liberal. But she also saw herself as the guardian of Virginia's noble heritage. She came from a very well-to-do family. She had married in a very elite family, and she was very protective of Virginia's historic legacy. And she was sort of a gatekeeper and wanted to make sure that nothing went into the book, The Negro in Virginia, that was going to change that or challenge that. She believed that the Black field workers who were carrying out these interviews were too deferential and sympathetic to ex-slave narrators. And she wrote about this to her supervisors and to Sterling Brown back in Washington, D.C. She believed that ex-slaves were unreliable and that they exaggerated negative aspects of slavery. And I'll just give you one example of this. So when Eudora Ramsey Richardson reads the transcript that the field workers had conducted with a formerly enslaved woman named Henrietta King, she was so livid that she believed the whole interview had been so exaggerated that she actually got in her car and drove from Richmond to Portsmouth to try to find the woman, so that she could prove that what the story that she had relayed wasn't true. And the story that Henrietta King had told was about how when she was a little girl, a young girl, her mistress white slaveholding woman who owned her, would often leave out bits of food, biscuits, and candy in particular, to try to tempt her into taking them without permission. And one day the mistress had left some pieces of candy out in the dish, and Henrietta was in the house cleaning or doing whatever chore she was supposed to be doing, and she ate the candy. The mistress notices that the candy is gone, demands to know where it is. Henrietta admits that she took the candy. So as punishment, the mistress put Henrietta's head on the floor under the leg of her rocking chair and rocked back and forth across Henrietta's jaw until she broke it. The jaw never healed properly. No doctor was ever called to set her jaw or to make sure it healed. And so Henrietta grew up with a deformed face that she described as a false face that would scare the children in the neighborhood, and that made it difficult for her to eat solid food for the rest of her life. So when Eudora Ramsey Richardson read this transcript, she didn't believe it. She's like, there's no way this ever happened. This is an exaggeration. So she gets in her car, she drives from Richmond to Portsmouth, and she's driving around the neighborhood where Henrietta lived, and she stops and asks someone for the old woman who looks like she's wearing a false face. And the person she asks says, oh yeah, that's Miss King. She lives right, down there. Richardson goes to the woman's house, knocks on the door. Henrietta King answers the door, and Eudora Ramsey Richardson sees immediately, right, by looking at Henrietta King's face, that what she had said was true. So she makes her apology. She gets back in her car and she drives back to Richmond, somewhat chastened, because she writes another letter to her boss in Washington, D.C. and says, you know what, I looked into this and it is in fact true. But Eudora Ramsey Richardson still takes a very heavy editing hand to all the interview transcripts and to the manuscript drafts of the Negro in Virginia. So when we get to the book, The Negro in Virginia, despite the fact that Priscilla Joyner's interview is comparatively quite long and has a lot of information, her contribution is sort of whittled down to these couple of sentences that I have on the screen for you now. And if you just read The Negro in Virginia, you would think that this is all there was to Priscilla Joyner's life. She says, my old mistress was the best woman in the world. She brought me up just like one of her own children until I was 12 years old. Then she paid for me to go to a colored school with my own people. And that's all there is in The Negro in Virginia of Priscilla Joyner's story. But I have read the only surviving transcript of her interview. And, spoiler alert, this is not what she says, at least not quite. So this was really the beginning of my investigation about Priscilla Joyner, because when you look into the historical record, and I began piecing together what I could find of Priscilla Joyner's life, it's immediately apparent that there is much more to her story than this, and it really sort of blows open, right, the history that Eudora Ramsey Richardson was trying to tamp down and even erase, I would argue. So let's begin. I'll begin with you. I'll take you through sort of how I began walking through and kind of excavating Priscilla Joyner's story. And it begins with the 1860 census. And I know for all of you genealogical researchers out there, you'll know how important the census is. I love the census. I spend many, many hours in this book, researching this book, going through census records. So this is the entry for 1860 for a man named Rix Joyner. It's his household. On the second line there is a woman named Ann Liza, his wife, 23, female. And then their children. So I have a daughter in the morning who is 5, another daughter named Margaret who is 4. I'm sorry, I made a mistake there in the transcription. Priscilla, 2, and a boy, Robert R., who is 8 months old. You can see in the after their ages, the next column is male or female, so whether they're male or female. The third column there to the right of their name is for race. And generally on the census at the time, if a person was white was the default. And so if a person was white, the census enumerator didn't write anything. They only wrote a B if someone was Black, or M if someone was, the term at the time was mulatto or a mixed race person. And they make these distinctions really based on just subjectively looking at someone. So if someone had very dark skin, they would most likely put a B for Black. But if someone was of a lighter brown color, they would put M for mulatto because they would assume that their racial ancestry was to some degree mixed. So they acted as if race was something that you could look at someone and determine very easily, making just a general visual determination. So if you're like me, you know, this entry gave you pause, and I'm sure it gave the census enumerator in 1860 pause as well, because what's unusual about it is that this is a white family. Rick Joyner is white, his wife Ann Liza is white, his children are white except for Priscilla, who is 2 years old, a female, and she has an M after her gender. So she is designated on the census as mixed race or mulatto. How in the world did this mixed race Black child become a part of this white household? Now, one possibility is that she is in fact a servant. She has been apprenticed. She is a member of a free Black household who has been apprenticed out to a white household to work as a servant. That happened frequently. In the period, there was a sizable free Black population in this part. I should say they're in North Carolina. I'm sorry, I think I neglected to mention that. They're in Nash County, North Carolina, near Rocky Mount. And there's a sizable free Black population at the time. And sometimes those people, or sometimes the state, would apprentice those children to white families as servants, and they would serve until they were 18 for the men and 21 usually for the women, sometimes later. But they would be listed on the census. They would be listed at the very bottom of the household. They would have a different last name. I found many entries like that, and they would be listed under here. You know, Rick's is listed as a farmer, right? That's the occupation category, and there's no occupation given for anybody else. If Priscilla was a servant in that household, she would be listed as servant. Okay. She's also, we know, not a slave, or is not being presented as a slave in this household. Slaves were enumerated on a separate census schedule called the slave schedule, and they were not, their names were never recorded. They were never recorded as, they were recorded simply as a property of a particular slaveholder. Their ages and their sex were recorded, but never their names. So Priscilla is not on the slave schedule. She is on the regular schedule, the regular 1860 census. So she is living as the child of Rick's and Ann Eliza Joyner. Okay, so this is the beginning of sort of this excavation of this seemingly unusual situation that Priscilla has been born into. So what does she actually say about her origins in her interview? Well, if you go through the interview transcripts, I'm going to give you a few sort of bits and pieces of what she actually says. And this is a photo of Priscilla She says, here's the story that Miss Ann Liza, my mother, she said she was, told me after I'd grown up a bit. She said, it seems my mother took up with a colored man, and she never would say who it was. The colored people all knew about it and wanted to take care of me in the quarters, but my mother refused, told them that I was her baby and she was going to raise me herself. And so the story that Priscilla tells to the interviewers is that Rix Joyner was kind of a ne'er-do-well. He was as my mother would say, a no account person, a no account man. He wasn't any good at farming. He showed no interest in farming. And the farm itself and the land and everything had come to him through his marriage to Ann Liza. Ann Liza said that her father had given them the land and the slaves that they owned on this farm. But if you go back and you look at the 1860 census, they own $600 in real estate and $200 in personal property. So they are not wealthy by any stretch of the imagination. So if they are slaveholders, they're very, very small slaveholders. They're not very wealthy at all. Back to the next slide where we were. Ann Liza told Priscilla later on that Rix had taken 2 enslaved people without her permission and sold them. And that when he did this, she kicked him out of the house. She told him to get lost, that he had to get those 2 enslaved people back or he was not to come back. So he leaves the family, he leaves the household for some period of time. And it's while he's gone that Ann Liza takes up with a Black man. We don't know if it was an enslaved Black man or if it was a free person of color. And the Joyners live within spitting distance of free people of color, which was not uncommon. We think of the South as being a very segregated society. That wasn't until much later, and in the countryside, that those rules often didn't apply anyway. In the antebellum period, especially among middling and poor people, they often lived, in very close proximity to one another. Priscilla, imagine that, when Rix finally does return to the farm and Priscilla is there, she has given birth to this Black baby. She says, from what I've heard later, those must have been troublous days, as one can imagine. And what Ann Liza says is that she basically makes a deal with Rix. She says, okay, if you accept this child and let me keep her, then you don't have to pay me back for those 2 slaves that you sold. Now, Ann Liza needs to get him to sort of sign on and accept this deal, because if he doesn't, and if he divorces her, and he would have grounds to divorce her, adultery, then she would lose her children, because they were not, a mother would the children, in the case of a divorce at the time, children would go with the father. They were considered to be, not the property, but they were the fathers. So mothers had no legal rights to their own children. And in particular, a white woman who had a mixed race child one of the possible things she would face is that the state would bind out or apprentice that child, would take it away from her, which was commonly done. And basically, although she wouldn't technically be a slave, she would be an indentured servant, she would be placed in another person's home for them to raise. So either way, if Ann Liza didn't get Rix to accept this deal that she was proposing, then she would lose her children, not only her white children, but Priscilla as well. But Priscilla is not sure that this is the truth. This is only what Ann Liza has told her. And she says that, and she never knows who her real parents are. She's never sure. Ann Liza would never say who her father was, and Priscilla asked her repeatedly throughout her life, even on Ann Liza's deathbed. Priscilla begs her to tell her finally before she dies who her father was, because she just needed to know. But Ann Liza never would. And so she, throughout her interview, she has kind of hedges her bets, and she's doubtful. The way Ann Liza has behaved to her, the fact that she has kept this secret about her father, and that she's kept her, at least until she was 12 years old, apart from the people that Priscilla refers to as my people, Black people, people of color, makes her question whether or not she was in fact her biological mother. And once Priscilla goes to live in a community of freed people in nearby Tarboro, which is about 10 miles or so away from Rocky Mount, and she lives with a Black family. She goes to a Freedmen school in the area, and she lives with a community of freed people there, of former slaves. She begins to hear stories about white slaveholding women who would take enslaved children into their households and try to manipulate them and raise them as their own children in a way. So this was not an uncommon thing to happen. Slaveholding women would often take a Black child as a pet, and they would often call them that as their pet. And they would take them when they were very, very young, toddlers or very young children, and they would take them away from their mothers and their families and bring them into the house to live and be sort of a personal caretaker or servant or housemaid, training them to be that as they're growing up. But of course, really what this does is allow the white slaveholding woman to manipulate the affections and the loyalty of these children in such a way that it alienates them from their actual family. And there's a really poignant interview in the Writers Project Ex-Slave Narratives by a woman who is also a North Carolina native named Sarah Debro, who talks about how her mistress, who she referred to as Miss Polly, did this to her, took her away from her mother, brought her into the house, and gave her, new dresses, clean dresses with ribbons, treated her, comparatively well. She got to eat better food and extra food. And the thing that Sarah liked best, that Miss Polly took her around in the carriage, and she got to ride in the carriage with Miss Polly, and she would sit and she would sort of hold her keys and her little personal items and carry them for the woman. So this was how, Miss Polly manipulated young Sarah, so that when the war comes and emancipation happens, and Sarah's biological mother comes to get her and take her home, Sarah actually, she doesn't want to go, and she holds on to Miss Polly's skirts, and her mother has to actually pull her away. And she remembers going back to her mother's cabin, and at night, sort of looking up through a hole in the ceiling, because it's not, nice like the house where Miss Polly lived, and just crying because she missed the nice bed and the clean sheets and the, the warm food and the material things that Miss Polly had given her in order to ply her affections. Polly Murray, the writer and activist, also recalls how her great-grandmother was raised in a similar way by her white mistress and alienated from her mother. And Polly Murray remembers growing up, she remembers her great-grandmother still sort of bore, even though she was an old woman, bore the effects of this manipulation, this emotional manipulation, and would only speak about her own mother in, with pity, right? Because her own mother had to watch as this white woman raised her daughter, taught her to look down on the other enslaved people, and sort of kept her apart, and taught her to think of herself as somehow apart from her own blood relations. So this was not unusual. And so these are the kind of stories that Priscilla is hearing. And as she's growing up and becoming a teenager and becoming a young woman and getting married and having her own children, she's thinking, is Analyzer really my mother? Is this the way a mother, treats her child? Is this the kind of care and concern that I'm showing for my children? And it's all really just to say how this sort of left, a hole in Priscilla's heart, not knowing who her father was, not knowing the truth of her own origins, not being able to rely on the woman who claimed to be her mother to tell her truthfully who she was and where she came from, left her with a, sort of a real absence in her life. And her story of emancipation, and what I lay out in the rest of the book, is her efforts to fill that void. And it was a journey that she shared with many, many other members of the charter generation who dictate their life stories in the Writers Project, in these slave narratives, or rather ex-slave narratives. And, the kind of questions that the field workers would ask them: what did it feel like to be free? When did you know you were free? What did you do when you were free? They tell really complicated, hard stories. It's not about, getting the right to vote or doing these things that we normally associate with emancipation, with this transition from slavery to freedom. It's really these very personal, intimate stories about trying to find lost relatives, about being able to choose who to marry, what to name their children, making these very, what might seem to us as very sort of inconsequential sort of decisions, are so full of meaning and consequence for the charter generation. And that's what I've endeavored to tell in this book, are those kind of intimate, personal stories to really, provide texture to the lives of formerly enslaved people as they're making this transition. So we're going to have some questions in a moment, but before you do, I want to end with this painting, which is one of my favorite pieces by one of my favorite artists, Winslow Homer, The Cotton Pickers from 1876. And when I see this picture, it really sort of reminds me of why I wanted to write this book. Most white Americans, whether they were army officials or politicians or missionaries, who were, traveling throughout the post-war South, committed to aiding the freed people, they really had a very superficial, very impoverished view of what freed people's lives would be like after slavery. And almost, to a person, they imagined that they were going to be picking cotton, right? That's what white people wanted them to do. That's what the government wanted them to do. They wanted to get the Southern agricultural economy back on track. And they were going to still pick cotton just like they had before the war, only now they were going to be paid for it. So it's a really sort of paltry view of what freedom would entail for the majority of enslaved African Americans. But I think what Winslow Homer does with this painting in portraying these two young women who are picking cotton is, you look at the woman on the right in the red top, and she's looking off into the distance, and she has this kind of contemplative look on her face. It makes you think, she's looking off in the distance. What is she looking at? What is she thinking of? The woman on her right is sort of, letting her fingers, very slowly touch the cotton bolls. She looks like she is totally zoned out there. Her mind is elsewhere, sort of mechanically, but she's thinking about something else. And freed people, they all had, dreams and hopes and desires that most white people just really didn't care about and weren't interested in trying to understand. But I think Winslow Homer, to me, when I look at this painting, he captures that. What it felt like to be free, what it felt like to try to dream and imagine what life could possibly be like. And it makes me think of another interview that I talk about in the book with a man named Robert Glenn, who had been enslaved in Kentucky, not far from where I grew up. And he said, he just didn't kind of know what to do. When emancipation came, he said he would lay awake at night building air castles. Those are the words he used. And that's why Sterling Brown really loved the vernacular expression of rural Black Southerners. He said he would build air castles as to what he would do. And you can just sort of imagine him lying there, sort of dreaming and imagining what was possible. And what life might hold for him at this point in time, and how he was going to go about achieving these things that he had only ever dreamed about before. So the biggest point I want to get across with this book, and that I hope you come away with if you read it, is that freedom was not a singular sort of momentary event. It was a long, extended process. It is still unfinished, and we are still living in slavery's shadow. We are still experiencing racial violence, police brutality, disparities in medical care and access to education. These are all obstacles to a full freedom that Priscilla Joyner and the other members of the Charter generation experienced, and that Black Americans, many of them, still endure today. Just a couple of weeks ago, Congress finally passed a federal anti-lynching bill. It only took 125 years and more than 4,000 documented murders of African Americans in the United States for it to happen. And I grew up in the South, right? I grew up in Southern Kentucky in the 80s and 90s, and there was a de facto ban on topics related to race and racism. We just didn't talk about it, right? There wasn't a de jure, a law banning these things. We just avoided it. Every year in history class, when we never read about slavery. I never encountered Frederick Douglass or Harry Jacobs or any of those wonderful works of American literature or history until I got to college. So even in places where there aren't laws banning the discussion of these topics in our classrooms, many classrooms, American classrooms still today, avoid these tough subjects. They avoid things that are uncomfortable to talk about. Teachers are generally not taught how to have these tough discussions and these hard conversations. And so part of my mission, my professional mission as a historian, whether I'm teaching in the classroom or I'm doing research and publishing, is to encourage audiences to confront these tough histories and these hard histories. And so that's what you'll be getting if you read my book, and I hope you do read my book. And now I think we're going to move in and take some questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Emberton. That was very, very interesting. We do have some questions that we received in advance with registration. And the first one that we'd like to ask is, Maddie asks, will we ever be able to walk around in freedom with so much racial disparity everywhere, including healthcare and in aging?
That's a great question. And it's really one that's at the heart of my work. And these discussions that historians that we're having, and that I'm trying to bring audiences into having about the long emancipation. I think we are still living with many of these unresolved issues that people were fighting about and dying over in the 1860s and the 1870s, and they're unresolved. And I think a lot of times people wish we would come to resolution. And I think a lot of times people assume we have come to resolution. We heard a lot about being in a post-racial America in 2008 with the election of our first African-American president, Barack Obama, but that kind of, wishful thinking, I think, has been, unfortunately put to rest. And so I don't know if we'll ever resolve them. But I think it's a continued fight, and we have to be vigilant and stay and listen to one another, and be prepared to push forward and to push through these issues.
Thank you for that. Margaret?
So taking us back to 1860, 1870, I was fascinated to read about Freedom Hill, the community that Priscilla went to when Ann Liza pushed her out of the house. And you said it's near Tarboro, and it became to Princeville, did it?
Yes.
I've been spending a lot of time on Google Maps trying to figure out where all this is. And we did get a question of about life in those communities, in those free communities where Blacks were living, and kind of what it was like there and what the traditions were like. And did it replicate the White South, or was it a completely different place? To those of you out there, I should say, read the book. You'll get a really full portrait of these communities and how interesting they were, burial rights, all sorts of things. But tell us a little bit about that free community.
Yeah. So Princeville, North Carolina is one of the oldest, I think it actually claims to be the oldest all Black town in the United States. It still exists today. It sits right next to the town of Tarboro. And it was, when it was initially founded, it was a settlement called Freedom Hill. And two white slave owners deeded some land that they thought was kind of, no good land. You couldn't really farm on it, next to the Tar River, to some of the people who had been enslaved on their plantations, for them to sort of have a little settlement where they could, like I said, it's not great farming land, but this is where the freed people in the area began settling and building houses. At first, it's a sort of encampment during the Civil War. Union soldiers camp there towards the end of the war for a while, then they leave. And then the people themselves, begin building a little community. And within just, a decade or so, they've got blacksmiths, they've got, churches, they've got a school, and they've got, all the makings of a functioning free Black town. But all the while, they're sort of battling former slaveholders in the area to maintain control of that. And one of the things that former slaveholders do, and that I go into a lot in the book, is to try to apprentice their children, to take their children away, to claim that these children ought to come and work for them, to, be apprenticed until they're, well into adulthood, and that the freed people couldn't possibly take care of their own children. So there are these, legal struggles over family life, over working conditions, that go on for decades.
It was so fascinating to me. I did want to jump ever so quickly. We want to close with the reading soon, but I wanted to ask ever so quickly about your notes section at the end of the book, which those of us who are deep into genealogy and history spend a lot of time flipping through notes. And I noticed one note hopped out at me that you talked about the tradition of researching history that's hard to research and hard to put together. And the Annette Gordon Reed and others writing from their own experience and bringing to life history in a way, connecting dots that has to be done to bring to life stories. And I just thought you would talk a tiny bit about what you've done. The book is an amazing weaving of facts, of so many stories, but you also have to connect a dot here or there. How do you figure out where to connect the dot, the fact versus fiction?
Right. So anyone who is interested in trying to piece together the lives of people who were enslaved, most of whom did not leave behind the written records we typically rely upon to piece together people's lives, you have to be creative, and you have to archives and find the bits and pieces that you can find. But then you also have to use what a historian named Paula Fass calls a disciplined imagination, right? So when you're talking about and thinking about what was possible, what Priscilla or someone else might have wanted or hoped for in a particular situation, you rely on your own sense of the human condition. And a lot of times historians, we're trained to be empirical people, right? And to have evidence for things. And if the evidence doesn't say it for sure, then you can't write about it. That's, often the way we're trained professionally. But if you want to write the histories and you want to write about the lives of people like Priscilla Joyner and others in the charter generation, you have to be able to ask the questions and to think creatively about what the evidence tells us, but also what it doesn't tell us. So there are places in the book where, I get a little speculative, like later on when Priscilla loses many of her children to tuberculosis, right? There's a tuberculosis epidemic among rural Southern Blacks at the time, and she loses several children and a grandchild to tuberculosis. And it's a time for me, I think, to imagine what that must have been like for her and her husband to try to rely upon or to pay a white doctor to come and visit them at their house when it was, thought of at the time that, Black tuberculosis patients were dirty and sort of caused the disease themselves. And what it, imagine the sort of what it was like for them to try to, get medical care for the children that they loved, and to know and to realize that, there's really nothing that they can do for them. And to try to think about what those experiences must have been like for her and for her husband, and how they might have impacted her understanding of, her place in the world and what was possible. That's the time for us to use that disciplined imagination.
Well, you do it so very effectively. And I really enjoyed the book. So moving toward closing, you have picked out a really, we asked the doctor to read us tonight from the book. So Dr. Carole Emberton is going to read ever so briefly a wonderful passage. Back to you, Carole, for a closing reading, as we do in many of our talks here in American Inspiration at the library. Go ahead.
Thank you. So this is from the epilogue at the end of the book. Priscilla Joyner died on January the 13th, 1944, just 6 days shy of her 86th birthday. Her only surviving daughter, Liza, gave the attending physician the information he needed to fill out her death certificate: female, colored, widowed, birthplace, Nash County, North Carolina, usual occupation, housework. The doctor spelled Priscilla's mother's name like it sounded, Ann Liza. And in the space for her father's name, he simply wrote, unknown. Crocker Funeral Home would see to her funeral just as they had for her husband and children who preceded her in death. It was no small affair. The choir of St. Paul Baptist Church joined 2 soloists, 3 pastors, and several other speakers who remembered Priscilla Joyner, including 22 grandchildren, 25 great-grandchildren, and 1 great-great-grandchild. Relatives from North Carolina traveled to Suffolk to say goodbye, along with Liza, Frank, and Harry, her surviving children. Priscilla was then buried in Oak Lawn Cemetery beside Lewis, her husband, and her children, David, Mamie, Jency, Priscilla, and Hyman, who had died in 1942. A death certificate and obituary can tell us only so much. The identity markers these documents convey, female, colored, widowed, as stated on her death certificate, or wife of Lewis Joyner, the headline of her obituary, failed to convey many of the key facts of her life and personality. We do not know precisely how she was eulogized at her funeral, what stories the mourners told about her as they shared a post-funeral meal in the church fellowship hall or back at Liza's house. Did they speak of her tireless devotion to friends and neighbors? Did they shake their heads at her many sorrows, all those children lost to TB, and her endurance in spite of it all? Did they whisper about her early years, her white mother, the way her half-brothers cheated her out of her inheritance? In my search to better understand the importance of Priscilla Joyner's life and what her legacy may have been for those who knew her, I found one tiny shard of insight. It is a 1962 announcement celebrating the flower show winners at the 56th annual Tidewater Fair. That fall, 18 years after her death, the Priscilla Joyner Garden Club of Suffolk placed third. It may not seem like much, but for me, that notice brought Priscilla's story full circle. The first time I met her, when I read the interview, she was in her garden. The garden was obviously a place of refuge for her, and she used its blossoms as a buffer to soften the difficult memories that the visit from the interviewer stirred up. She was proud of what she had accomplished and the fact that others took pleasure in the beauty that she created. She was a renowned gardener. It took skill and knowledge, which she may have acquired as a young girl from the notable gardeners of Freedom Hill, a town that would become famous for its flowers. The people there, Priscilla's people, planted the seeds of freedom and coaxed beauty from the unforgiving earth that L.L. Dancy begrudgingly gave them, earth that had soaked up the sweat and blood of generations of their people. The constant planting, dividing, weeding, transplanting, pruning back, praying for rain, lugging buckets of water when there was none. It was all so much hard work. It was also a supreme act of faith. Put in the seedlings, pack the soil with crushed eggshells and leftover coffee grounds, and hope. This was how those who knew Priscilla Joyner remembered her. They honored her memory by giving their garden club her name, a tribute to her patience and perseverance, and also her artistry. In the same way, Black poet and novelist Alice Walker reflected on her own mother, who, like Priscilla, was a renowned gardener. The flowers were so numerous and beautiful around Walker's childhood home in Georgia that strangers would often get out of their cars and ask to stand or walk among her art, as Alice Walker called it. Walker recalled watching her mother in the garden and how the overworked, exhausted woman who spent her days working in the fields alongside her husband and her evenings cooking, canning, and sewing looked as she tended to her prized flowers. Walker writes, "I notice that it is only when my mother is working in her flowers that she is radiant. She is involved in work her soul must have, ordering the universe in the image of her personal conception of beauty." Thank you.
Thank you. That is such a beautiful image to leave us with at this time of year and truly forever. Women in their gardens, mothers, families, just making sense of the world in small ways that we can. It feels so true even to this day. So thank you for that reading, and thank you so much for your talk. A reminder to our audience out there, copies of Carole's book, To Walk About in Freedom, are available from Porter Square Books. It is so beautifully written. It may be good for Mother's Day, a very thought-provoking Mother's Day it would be. Order online using the code AMINT22 to get a signed copy. They'll be sending out books next week once they've met up with Carole's signature, as I said. Moving toward closing, I want to say thank you from all of us at American Ancestors NEHGS. We are really delighted and honored to have presented tonight's author talk with the Boston Public Library. If you are researching a community or a family or an individual, you might find our library or education center useful. Our stacks on Newbury Street are now open to the public, and NEHGS members can delve into our digital archives, gaining access anytime to 1.4 billion searchable family records. Free to the public, you can chat with one of our genealogists. Our Brew Family Learning Center hosts many great educational programs aimed at all levels of family historians. So if you're new to family research, looking for building blocks, or you're a pro hunting for new angles into the 1950 census that was just released, do check our website and see the links in the chat. And if you are a literary sort, you'll see 3 author events on the screen coming up. Free author talks. On April 26th, we're hosting Professor Anne Hyde, an historian of the American West. Her book, Born of Lakes and Plains, is about the mixed descent people who helped create our country, intertwined, again, intermarried with settlers from all over. On May 10 at 3 p.m. with the Boston Public Library, we'll be zooming overseas to meet up with Dennis Duncan, a university lecturer and author in London. He'll take us through the surprising little-known history of the book index, revealing how indexes, this everyday tool, have shaped centuries of knowledge and information. And back here on May 16th, we are going to look in depth at just the American painter that Carole talked about, Winslow Homer, and his image of America. Author William Cross will be in discussion with Professor John Kegg, who is well-versed in our country's cultural history, a philosopher himself. We'll hope to see you soon again. Kristen, back to you.
Thank you, Margaret and NEHGS. Thank you, Dr. Carole Emberton, for sharing your work, and Priscilla Joyner's story with us. And thank you all for attending this evening. Thank you for your questions. For those of you who submitted questions that we didn't get a chance to get to, thank you for sharing those with us. Before we close, just very quickly, a reminder that the Boston Public Library has resources and services for people of all ages, both online and in person, and you can find out more at bpl.org. And we also have some programs coming up. There are 3 that I'd just like to quickly share with you. On Monday, May 2nd at 6 p.m., both here in person at the Central Library of the Boston Public Library, as well as online via Zoom, you can hear John Jacobs, who is the co-founder of the Life is Good Company, and he'll be in conversation with David Leonard, who is the Boston Public Library president. On Wednesday, May 18th, in partnership with the State Library of Massachusetts, we will be talking to author Harun Mogul, whose new book, 2 Billion Caliphs, A Vision of a Muslim Future, will be held virtually, and you can find out more at bpl.org about how to sign up for that. And our final Lowell lecture for this year, we will have Dr. Eddie Glaudy Jr., who is an author and a thought leader, and he will again be in conversation with David Leonard, BPL president, and that will also be here at the Central Library in person as well as online via Zoom. You can find out about all of these talks and more at bpl.org, and the links are also in the chat. Thank you all again so much for joining us this evening. We hope to see you again soon in person or at another event. Take care. Good night.